and it will be available on the website afterwards. Okay, so I think that we are ready to get going then. I think we've got, if people are still, if the people will still be entering as we carry on, but they'll just have to catch up, I'm afraid. So over to you, Alex. Thank you very much for your start, and then we will get all the questions at the end. Okay, thanks everyone.
Lovely. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining. So as you can probably tell, we're going to have a little chat today about bee hotels and what you can do to support your solitary bees. I've aimed to give a sort of broad overview today, so it'll give you a good idea of the sort of life cycle of the bees that are going to be taking residence in these hotels, but it'll also give you some good guidelines for building your own, or if you want to buy one, what to look for. So we'll get going. So first, what is a bee hotel? Well, they're primarily they're in place to support solitary species of bee, but actually the term hotel really is probably a little bit incorrect. The bees don't really live in these structures, but the females use them to lay their eggs, and the offspring develop inside. So they're more similar to a bee nursery or maternity unit than a hotel. So essentially, what they're doing is they're providing that bridge between the adult and the larva, and it's somewhere where the larva can develop and stay safe until they're ready to hatch out. But it can also provide temporary shelter as well. So of course, in terms of nesting, it's primarily for the females, but you might find adult males often sheltering in there as well if it's a bit rainy or they just want to have a rest. So you may see some of those in there too. Actually, bee hotels have become incredibly popular, insect hotels in general, and have been rapidly commercialized. And as such, there's been a lot of controversy around how useful they are as a conservation tool, or as whether they're good for the bees or not. And if they're done incorrectly, they can be bad. So what we're going to look at today is how to do it right, and then hopefully you'll be able to enjoy having a bee hotel, enjoy being able to watch your bees, whilst also knowing that you're helping them out. It's important to stress as well that they don't benefit all bees. So I use the term solitary bee there, as you can see, and I'm using that as a catch-all for essentially all the bees other than the eusocial ones. So that's like your stingless bees or your western honeybee. But really, there are a lot of bees that sort of fit somewhere in between that model. And although the vast majority are solitary, there's lots of bees that have sort of subsocial or semi-social aspects to their biology and their ecology. And we will actually touch on one of those later. But they majorly benefit cavity nesting bees. So that's what you're going to find in your bee hotel. And actually, a lot of bees are ground nesters. In fact, well over half the bees in Australia are ground nesters. So these won't be benefiting them, but the way to look at a bee hotel is it's one part of your arsenal for helping to support bees. So let's have a little chat about cavity nesting bees, and sort of what they are, and how they breed, and how their life cycle sort of goes through. So as I mentioned, hotels target these species in particular, and these are the types of bees that you're going to be seeing in your bee hotels. Now, what they do is, as their name suggests, they tend to use pre-existing cavities in nature, and that's where they provision their offspring and they lay their eggs. Most species tend to occupy already vacant cavities, and they'll essentially create a pile of food upon which they will lay an egg, and then they'll partition that away and then move on to the next one, creating discrete cells. Within each is a single larva. Not all species do that, but the vast majority do. So there's going to be there's always exceptions to the rules, but I'm going to be quite general today and keep with the general most common facts about them. There's always a few species that have exceptions, but for the vast majority, that's how it works. So what the females do is they gather up pollen. That's the primary food source of the larva, and that's what's going to enable them to grow from the little egg they start out to right the way up to their adult form when they finally emerge. And the egg is laid on top of that once the provision's made. So they gather a provision first, then they lay an egg, seal it, move on, and that's the way it goes. So I want to talk a little bit about their life cycle, because the life cycle actually is quite important in terms of maintenance of your bee hotel, and that will become a bit clearer as we go on. But you want to be able to, you need to be able to fit in with their life cycle in terms of maintenance. So this will help us understand where that fits. So species of solitary bee, they can be either univoltine, which is where they reproduce one time in a year, or they can be multivoltine, so they might produce a number of times in a season. But irrespective of that, the vast majority of solitary bees have quite a limited activity range in terms of when they're active. So this can be due to weather conditions. So most of them, for example, are active between spring and autumn, and most of them aren't around during the winter time. But it can also be based on other things such as drought or flower availability. Many bees only forage from certain types of flowers, so therefore their emergence and their activity times is restricted to when those flowers are in bloom. So I just want to have a look at the little picture at the bottom right of your screen there. You can see on the very bottom you've got what is essentially a series of leaves, and this is the nest of a leafcutter bee. And what she does is she creates little parcels out of leaves, within which is her food store and little egg that will develop into a larva. What's also interesting is above that you can see there's another type of nest, and this is in a bee hotel, but actually that is a wasp's nest, a hunter wasp. And you can see that she's gathered up lots of spiders there, and she will lay her egg in there, and that's where her larva will feed from. So your bee hotel will attract other things, and that's not bad. And we'll have a look at some of those other residents later on as well. So back to the life cycle of the solitary bees. We mentioned that they're mainly active between spring and autumn. So generally speaking, adults tend to die off during the winter. They've done their job, they've reproduced, they've laid the eggs, and the offspring inside their little cells go into a sort of resting phase, what we call diapause. Now, diapause can actually vary quite widely between the bees. In fact, here in Australia, a species called Amygdala dawsoni, which is Dawson's bee, lives in the arid parts of Australia. There's been records of them diapausing for nearly 10 years. So it shows it's an incredibly adaptive way of lasting out periods of hardship. So here in New South Wales, most of the bees are going to diapause during the winter time to get through the cold, and they'll come out in the spring. But in other areas of Australia, there's different things to avoid. There's drought, for example, and that is one of the primary things for Dawson's bee. But it just shows how incredibly diverse bees' ecology and biology is. So I encourage everyone to look, because you'll find things weirder than fiction. Now, during this diapause phase, most bees tend to be at an immature phase, so sort of a pre-pupa stage. So they haven't reached their full adulthood yet. There are a few that overwinter as adults, but the vast majority here in Australia do go as pre-pupa. And then once the conditions become right, so during the springtime, they reach their final adult form, and out they come, and the cycle starts again. So, still on the cavity nesting bees, I just wanted to have a little chat about how varied they can be in terms of where they choose to nest. So they can utilise lots of different natural materials, and I mentioned that they tend to go in pre-dug cavities, things like wood borer holes. But they can also use old nests of other insects as well. So you might find things like mud dauber wasp nests being occupied by a solitary bee, and she's taken over once the wasp has left. But also they do adapt to our urban environment. So the little picture there on the right is a leaf cutter, and she's made her nest inside a metal fence post. So you can see it's very, very varied, and you really would be surprised where you see them. I remember attending a residence property here in Ku-ring-gai to have a look at their stingless bee hive, and on the way out there were lots of leaf cutters flying by, and they had decided they were going to nest in the hose pipe cover, and all the recessed screw holes, that's where they built their nests, and she'd already filled 3 of them. So they really can be in lots of different places. You might find them in door frames, window frames, ends of the hose. They really will go for lots of different types of cavity. So let's get on to now a little bit the nuts and bolts of it. What is a good hotel? So I put these on here because I'm not going to be providing you with a sort of design or a schematic today, because I don't think there really is one. But there are guidelines that you should follow. And if you follow these guidelines and your hotel matches these, then it should be effective. So the first one is the cavities that you use, the cavities that you create for these for the bees, need to be of a suitable diameter. So I've put there that it's generally between 5 and 8 millimeters. That's a very popular diameter. But actually, from about 4 till about 12 is also useful. You know, different bees are of different sizes, so they require different size holes. A lot of bees won't want to go for one that's too big, pardon me, but then they won't want to go for one that's too narrow either, because they can't get inside. So thinking about that when you're designing it is important. And having a varied amount of them is really useful, because then you can cater for more than one group. But also having the cavities of a suitable depth as well. And actually, this is one of the primary things that a lot of the commercial bee hotels don't do very well. They have far too shallow cavities. So I put about 150 millimeters here, but if it's longer than that, actually, that's fine. In many cases, if it's a very long cavity, you might find that the bees simply cap it a little bit further up. It's better to have too long than too short. The main reason for that is, one, they're not as attractive if they're too short to the bees, but also many solitary bees, they lay the females separately from the males in the nest. So often the females are towards the back and the males are towards the front. So that means that if you have a tube that's too short, it can skew the ratio between those two sexes. And of course, that's not really very good for the populations themselves. So making sure they're deep enough is really quite important. So using appropriate materials. The major thing that I wanted to highlight here is to avoid materials that don't breathe. So, and what I mean by that is in terms of moisture. So avoid things like plastic straws or glass, that type of thing. Because inside the confines of that nest, the larva is still respiring, it's still producing moisture. And so you can get a moisture buildup inside their cell. That can cause mold issues and can eventually kill the larva as well. So it's really good if you just use more breathable materials. So security. So what I mean by being secure is you don't want it wobbling about and moving around all over the place. So having it attached sturdily to a structure is useful. So whether that be something like a pole or a stand, or if you want to have it on a tree or something like that, then you can attach it firmly with wire or rope. Don't screw it into the tree, just because, you know, we don't want to harm the trees. You know, we love our trees, so just wire or rope is more than enough to secure it. You just don't want it wobbling about all over the place. And the main reason for that is that, you know, the bees need to reorientate themselves when they come back. And if that nest is moving around, it makes that much harder for them, and it makes it harder for them to recognize which is their hole. So protection against the elements. So, of course, naturally speaking, their natural environment is exposed to the elements. Fair enough. But when we're building a bee hotel, it is good to provide a little bit of extra protection. So the main way you can do that is having a decent sort of roof or something around it that prevents it getting really, really wet. Especially around the front where the entrances are going to be. And also, if it can be somewhere sheltered, then that also works. You don't want there to be too much wind or very strong winds moving over the front. So that's a good way to sort of protect it against the elements. You also making sure that whatever you use, it has a back to it, so that the front is the only open part of the bee hotel. You don't want to be able to see right the way through it. The last one I put on there is not too big. Now, I put a picture on there, as you can see, of what is termed now as a bee wall. These are increasingly popular, and you'll find them at community gardens and country parks and various places like that. But really, these are to be avoided. So if anyone was thinking about building one of these, I would avoid it because these are, having something that large, it encourages really unnaturally high nesting densities, and it also encourages mixed species assemblages. So what I mean by that is the idea of different species of bee nesting together, which would naturally not do so. I think an excellent analogy at the moment is the position we're in with coronavirus globally. The idea that having everything packed really close together can really increase things like disease transmission. And the same is true with this type of thing. You know, if you do have diseases or pests that are in these really large structures, it's much more easy for those to spread to all the different bees within there. So really try and avoid those and keep your nests a little bit smaller. And we'll have a look at that later. So what if you want to buy a bee hotel? Because there's loads out there. There really are. I mean, you can go into any almost any hardware store now or dollar shop or anywhere on the internet, and you'll be able to find somewhere to buy a bee hotel. But how do you know you're not buying a dud? Well, we've been over some of the guidelines that you want to apply to buying one. And so I've put a couple of bad ones here. So you can see the one on the left there. The reason that one's bad is because it's far too shallow. Far too shallow. It's not going to be of use to any bees being that shallow. And you're not going to get any uptake. And even if you did, it wouldn't be good for the bees. As we mentioned, it could easily skew the sex ratio. The same is true for one on the right there. I've perhaps been a little bit harsh on that one. It's still a little bit too shallow for me, but it's not as bad as the other one. But also, it's almost completely sheer on the face, so there's not a lot of protection there against rain that's going to be coming at the bee hotel itself. But this one's my personal favourite that I found. So this is well, it's useless really. It's far too shallow. It's got some compartments that there's just nothing in them. Yeah, the roof, it doesn't really do anything. So these type of things are the ones you want to avoid because they're not going to help. They're just going to end up sitting there, not full of any bees, and you'll just get things you don't want in them. So what about some good ones? So this is the picture from the title slide, and I've used this one because it's a really simple design, but it does the job. So you can see it's far deeper than all the other ones that were on that previous slide. It's got a clear back on it, and it's got a slight lip over the front. It's not too big. You know, you can't fit too much stuff in there, and it's securely fastened there to a piece of fencing. Simple, but it'll do the trick. Now this is a sort of a slightly different design. So rather than having a tube within which you put materials, this has just got holes drilled in. The holes are perhaps a little bit uniform in size, but other than that, it's deep enough. There's not too many of them, and you can securely attach to something. And then this one is sort of this is the idea of building a little house within which you can put your materials. So the reason I've chosen this one as a good example is because it's not too big. You can see you can't fit too much material in there. It's got a really good roof. The roof is on so that it guides water away from the front. It's got a good overlap on all sides, and it's firmly attached there to a post. So you can see that it's going to be able to withstand the elements. It's not too big, and you'll be able to get some good material in there. And most importantly, if you are making if you're buying a hotel or making a hotel, whatever, the way you insert materials, those materials must not be glued in or attached in any way, because you need to be able to remove them, and we'll get onto that later on. But why not just build your own one? Because actually it's pretty easy, it's cheap in most cases, and it's really great fun. If you've got kids, it's great fun. Actually, if you've not got kids, it's great fun. It really is. You can be really creative, and there's nothing quite like making your own one and then seeing the bees take up residence. It makes you feel really, really good. I've just put a couple of examples on here. So this is the sort of, you know, natural look type of thing where you might use an old log or something like that. If you do that, don't use anything that's really wet, or if it is, then make sure you dry it out thoroughly before you use it. But other than that, should be absolutely fine. And you can see with these examples, you know, there's not too many holes in them. They're quite varied, and they're of a decent depth. So this is another one, sort of the other sort of homemade style thing, and then this is more fits to the idea of having a little house within which you put materials. And I've just put these two up because you can see they're nice and small. They're deep enough that they'll allow decent length materials in, and you can use wooden blocks to put those in, like we've got there, or there's sort of bamboo tubes. And we'll talk a little bit more about the materials you can use in a second. These have been painted green, but they don't have to paint it green. And you know, they can be natural wood look if you like. The one on the left there could probably do with the roof having a little bit more of an overhang, but other than that, you know, they're fairly good. Well, you really can be quite creative. I mean, as long as you follow the sort of guidelines in terms of, you know, hole depth, diameter, size, protection from the elements, you can be really creative. I've seen lots of different designs, things such as I've seen people use old sort of oldie style metal watering cans and filling those with materials. The internet's a great source of inspiration, so you know, you really do get creative and make something unique. But now that you understand a little bit more about the rules of what the hotel needs to do, you can filter out the good ideas from the bad ones. So I put this last one up here because this is essentially just, this is a very cheap sort of economy version of making one. It's a piece of old drain pipe with some tubes placed in. Not particularly aesthetically pleasing, I grant you, but you could modify that quite easily to make it prettier. So if you imagine that rather than using the plastic tubing there, you could get some of the large bamboo that you can get from hardware stores, and you could insert your tubes inside that. Much prettier thing to look at, perhaps a terracotta chimney pot. So you can see how you can take ideas from somewhere else and you can modify them and make them suit whatever you want to do with them. So let's have a look at the materials, because if you decide to, whether you decide to do a little house within which you store materials, or whether you go for something that's more sort of inclusive, like the wooden blocks, there's different bits and pieces that you can do. So bamboo stems is a really common one, and it's one that you'll find in a lot of the ones that you might buy as well. Bamboo's great because it's really easy to get your hands on. It's got a range of different diameters. So you can provide for lots of different bees, and you can cut it to length relatively easily. So when you're doing bamboos, always make sure that they're blind. So what I mean by that is when you buy a bamboo cane, it'll have the nodes on. And these are hard pieces in the bamboo where there's no hole in. When you're cutting them, always make sure that one end's got the node on, because then you've already got a perfectly blind tube with one entrance hole and it's blind at the end, and the bees will far prefer that to an open one. Make sure that the knuckles are at the end though. Actually, if you look in the picture on the left hand side there towards the top right, there is one that's been put in the wrong way around. You can see the knuckle is facing outwards. No one's going to go in that. So make sure you get the knuckles at the back and the entrances at the front. The other one is I've put pithy canes here. So I've got lantana or rubus, so sort of like raspberry canes. But anything that is a pithy cane will do. So reeds, rushes, that type of thing will also work. And these are particularly useful for reed bees. And we'll have a little look at what they look like and how they take up residence later on. These canes, I would say, make these a little bit longer. So we mentioned that about 150 millimeters is a good depth. I would probably go for about sort of 200 to 250 with these, just to make them a little bit longer, mainly because they're quite narrow, and the uptake of them in terms of the bees will be quite dependent on how large they are. But with these, you can, I mean, as you can see the picture there, it's just tied up with a piece of wire and secured somewhere, and that is a perfectly acceptable way to do it. So the other major one that you can use on the bottom there is drilled wooden blocks. Drilled wooden blocks are really good because it's really easy to control the diameter of the hole, because you can use different size drill bits, and it's really easy to control the depth as well. Same principle applies with these as the bamboo stems. You want them to be blind. You don't want to drill all the way through the block. But what you can do with these as well is, if you can, it's worth angling the hole slightly upwards when you drill it, about 5 degrees. It's been found that bees prefer that, and it's most likely due to the perception that water won't get stuck inside because it'll all flow outwards. So they like that little incline. Also, if you're able, you can char the outside of those holes once you've drilled them. That has two benefits. So one, it removes any splinters or burrs, and that's important because bees' wings are very fragile and they won't want to go into a hole that's really rough. But also, it's been found that bees seem to be more attracted to that dark ring. Why that is pretty unknown. I think it could be due to it being easier to recognise that it's there, because there's that contrast. But if you haven't got that, it's not a problem. You will still get residents. But what you should do is once you've drilled it, make sure you get a little bit of sandpaper or something and just get those splinters and burrs off. And that'll do the trick for you. So there's some other materials that I wanted to talk about that provide for a different sort of set of bees. I've called them other materials because I personally would normally keep them separate from the materials we've just discussed, for the same reason as the large bee wars, in the sense that I try to avoid encouraging different species to nest together that wouldn't normally do so naturally. So mud bricks here, these are really easy to make, and they're primarily to benefit your blue-banded bees and your teddy bear bees. And who wouldn't want to benefit them, because they're as cute as a button. They're really easy to do, and it's essentially just, you want sort of powdery clay soil. You can get it wet, pack it inside a container. The ones on the left here, they've been put into some downpipe. Use sort of the end of a pencil to make some little guide holes. Don't push them all the way through. They only need to be maybe ½ centimetre deep. Let them dry in the sun, and then you can stack them just like that. Because the reason you don't need to do the whole hole is because the blue banders and the teddy bears, they will dig their own hole. But what the pilot hole does is it sort of encourages them to look at it as a nesting habitat, and then hopefully they'll take it up. I've put a link to how to make those on the last slide, so you'll be able to get that reference and possibly make your own if you can. If you haven't got any sort of powdery clay soil on your property, which is entirely possible, you can use things like fine tennis loam. That works really well as well. So on the right hand side, I've put soft dead branches. So the bee you see in the picture there is a green carpenter bee. These are particularly spectacular, and we're very lucky here in Ku-ring-gai that we live in one of the only places where this bee still exists. So it was very commonplace, but its range has contracted significantly. So now we find them in New South Wales on the Sydney Basin, sort of up to the Queensland border, and there's a small population of them on South Australia, Kangaroo Island. Now, there's two species. They're quite hard to tell apart, and I'm not going to go into that here. But they both have very similar nesting habitats. If you are lucky enough to see one of these, enjoy it, because they're spectacular to watch. They're really quite large, beautiful coloration, both male and female, and you'll really have a spectacle to watch. Now what they do is they nest in soft dead wood, and as the name suggests, carpenter bee, they dig their own burrows. So what you can do is, if you've got sort of any soft dead branches that you clear into, things like jacaranda or mango or banksia, they can be sort of tied together and provided as habitat for these. You can put these in sort of in like a house, like you would with the other materials we looked at for the bee hotel, but often they nest in vertical branches, which you can stack. So it's sometimes better to have a sort of slightly different setup for those, just because they're not going to fit quite so well with the other ones. And if you're very fortunate, you might get some uptake. Naturally speaking, as well, these also nest in the stems of grass trees. So if you do have any old flowering stems of grass trees, leave them, because these guys really need them. They're one of the bees that were majorly decimated by the bushfires, and because of the way their nesting habitat takes a long time to come in to maturity, and so much of that is lost, we really are quite worried about this group. And there is a conservation project ongoing on Kangaroo Island, and I know that that's going to be hopefully extended here to New South Wales as well. And I'll put a link at the end to that project if you're interested in learning a bit more. So let's get on to placing your hotel. Location. It is really important, and it will make a big difference on the uptake to your hotel. So you can have a really well-designed hotel, but you do have to have it in the right type of place to encourage the most uptake. So bees in general, they prefer a sunny aspect. So what I mean by that is you want it northeast or easterly, so it catches the morning sun. Morning sun's the most important for this, really, so it gives them that temperature boost so they can get going. You do want to avoid, or at least provide protection from, the really hot afternoon sun. So you might do that by having quite a large overhanging roof to provide the shade during that period of the day, or strategically placed in your garden to take advantage of shade, let's say from a tree or perhaps the house itself. I'd also say avoid thoroughfares as well. So it's really tempting to put these in a place where you're always going to be so that you can watch them all the time. But it might put bees off if there's lots of large animals walking past it all the time. So I would choose a place in your garden that you don't necessarily walk by all the time. And when you go to have a look, you'll go to have a look because you want to look at the bee hotel, and that's great. And going to watch them is one of the best parts of it. So don't feel that you can't go and see them, but just have them somewhere a little bit quiet so that you can go and see them when you want, rather than sort of walking by them all the time. I'd also say that to keep them elevated. So you don't want them right on the ground. It's not going to get a great deal of uptake there. I tend to go for sort of chest height, although I appreciate that's quite ambiguous because it depends how tall you are. So at least a metre off the ground is good. It helps the bees take flight, but also it makes it easier for you to watch them. And as I said, that's one of the best parts of it. So try and do that. It's also worth considering, if you can, and you've got the ability to do so, place them near some floor resources. Because then the great thing is you'll get to watch them not only forage but nest as well. And it's important to remember that bees, solitary bees especially, are what we call central place foragers. So they have a place from which they leave to gather food, and they come back to that place. So, and because they don't have a particularly large foraging range, most solitary bees probably wouldn't go more than a few hundred meters to forage. So having them somewhere where they can get their hands on their food quickly is great, and it's a great excuse to plant up and include that as part of your bee hotel. So we've mentioned weather protection before, but I just wanted to reiterate the point. So the idea of waterproofing, if your nest tubes are going to get wet, then you're either going to lose the bees that are in there, or they just won't take up residence in them. So making sure it's got a decent roof and that it's got a back on it is really quite important. It doesn't have to be anything elaborate, it just needs to keep the water off as well as it can. And shelter from the wind. If you can imagine being the size of a bee, right, on a breezy, brisk day, it's probably going to be pretty difficult to fly around in that type of breeze. So if that wind is moving across the front of the hotel, it's going to make it difficult for them to take flight and also to land safely when they come back. So having them in a sheltered spot is really useful. Secure and sturdy, not swinging about, that's the key one. So the picture I put here, there's nothing wrong with the hotel really. It's quite a nice looking thing. It's not too big, it's deep enough, but that is attached with some rope. And of course, as soon as the wind starts to blow, the rope's going to twist about and move all over the place, which is not going to attract the bees. And also any bees that are there, they might fly off, and when they come back, the hotel has changed orientation, and it's really difficult for them to find where their hole is. And I've seen before, if you ever get to see a female bee go into the wrong tube and meet the other bee who's in there, they're not well received, put it that way. So we really do want to try and help them get to the tube that they're meant to be in. So cleanliness. So this is a really important part of the bee hotel, and it actually probably the most important thing that you can do to keep your hotel running long term. So again, we talked about bee walls earlier, and I mentioned that they encourage really high levels of nesting density, and they can encourage species that wouldn't normally nest together to nest together. Now this can increase parasite load, so that might be external parasites, things like parasitoids that come and lay their eggs inside the nest. It might mean mites that live inside the nest, or in all possibility, diseases could spread far more rapidly in these situations than they would if it was more spread. And this can often take a few seasons to show. So you might find that a new bee wall that's just been made looks fantastic and there's bees everywhere and it looks great. But in a few years' time, and perhaps some of you have already experienced this with your own bee hotels, that the uptake seems to drop off as the years pass, and it gets to the point where you've just got this sort of cobweb-ridden box sort of sitting there. And the main reason for that is that we do need to maintain it and keep it clean. So it's far better to have multiple but smaller widespread resources. So I'll put the photograph here of just a sort of another one of these logs that have been turned into a bee hotel. And you can see there's not too many holes in there, and you're not going to have a really high density of bees nesting in it. There's nothing wrong with having more than one. You can definitely have more than one. I would just say try and keep about 20 meters between each one, because of course, if you imagine having lots of small ones and then putting them all together, they kind of become a big one anyway. So we want to make sure we keep the distance between them. And this better simulates what the bees would find naturally. You know, naturally speaking, nesting habitat for cavity nesters is low density. All we're trying to do is provide them a little boost and enjoy seeing them in our gardens. It helps to keep parasite load at a minimum, and it limits things like the spread of parasites from nest to nest. But even with these, we do need to have a degree of maintenance involved. So there's two kind of ways that you can do this, but they all fall under the same umbrella of periodic replacement of materials. So often when bees hatch and they leave their nest, they do often return to the same spot that they hatch from to nest in, to lay again. And that's great, because that means that you can keep a population going where you are. But what that also means is that they're coming back to a hotel that perhaps is not as clean as it was when they were first in it. So you can do two things. You can essentially replace the materials in their entirety. So if you're using things like bamboo, then that's what I would recommend, or if you're using anything like that, because it's easier and it's more difficult to clean them. The other option, especially if you're using wooden blocks, like you can see here on the right, is to insert a paper tube inside. So that essentially creates a little sleeve within which the bee nests. And then towards the end of the season, you can remove that tube, has the bees in it, and you can replace it with a new one. That way your block is, and your hotel is perfectly clean. It's like changing the sheets. That's what it is. It's basically changing the sheets, and that's what you want to do. It's worth remembering, you can buy these paper tubes, and they're perhaps a millimetre and a half thick. So if you are buying them, remember, if you're going to drill holes, you want them to be a certain diameter, but you need to take into account the fact you're putting a tube inside. Or you can make your own. So you can make your own by essentially rolling paper around a pencil or something and then inserting it inside the hole. Try and avoid bleached paper if you can, if you're making those, and avoid anything with ink in it. So don't use something like newspaper or a glossy magazine or anything like that. So then, you can either use these sort of paper insert tubes if you've got a wooden block, or if you've got bamboo, you might want to replace them. The question then becomes, well, when do you do it and how do you do it? So we mentioned earlier the life cycle of the bees, and that the adults tend to die off during the winter, and they then develop as larvae inside the nest and they come out in the spring. So it's during the winter time that you're going to be able to change these materials over. So what I tend to do is I wait until the very end of winter, sort of beginning of spring, so sort of end of August, early September, and you can start this process. So I put on the last bullet point there, use for an emergence box. So what this is it's a way of cleaning your hotel, without the need to worry about whether you're going to destroy any of the bees that are inside. So if you've got paper tubes or you've got filled bamboo tubes, what you can do is at the end of the winter, start of spring, you can take those out, you place them inside an emergence box. So this is a wooden one here on the bottom left there, but it can just be a shoebox with a hole cut in the top. It's quite simple. And then you place them in there inside that emergence box, and that emergence box goes out ready for those bees to hatch. And they'll probably be hatching in a couple of weeks at that point. That leaves your hotel free of any full nests. So then you can replace the materials. So that's either replacing the paper tubes or replacing the bamboo tubes. Now, after that point, so for example, if you're using bamboo tubes, or perhaps you could also use a wooden block without the paper tubes and simply put the entire wooden block inside an emergency box and replace the wooden block. If you've done that, then you can clean them once the bees have hatched out. So you wait for them hatched out, and it'll be quite apparent because the seal on the front of the hole will be broken. And you can just use a pipe cleaner and water, and you can clean them out. And then if you're using something like the bamboo or using the wooden blocks, if you're feeling particularly thorough, you can pop them in the freezer overnight, and that'll kill any mites or anything that might be left over. And then they're fresh and they're ready to go for the next season. So it shows that there is a seasonal, periodic maintenance cycle to keeping these. And if you do that, you will find that you won't get that level of drop-off in uptake over the years, because actually your bee hotel will be as fresh and clean as it was when it was first made. So, as I mentioned there, the winter's a really good time to replace the old, also the old unoccupied material. So you might find that especially if you use something like bamboo, perhaps some of it's perished or it's gone a bit black or dirty, you can replace that as well and do it exactly the same way. You'll replace your occupied nest inside your emergency box, and then they'll hatch out and go that way. You don't have to use an emergency box. You can wait and leave them in situ inside their hotel, wait until they all hatch out in the very early spring, and then when you notice that they've hatched out, remove whichever one's hatched out and put a new one in. And you can do it that way. So let's have a little bit of a chat about some of the bees that you might see. And this is general, and I've got a couple of photographs on here of specific species, but you might see a range of different ones. So your leaf cutters are one of the most common bees that you'll find taking residence in your bee hotel. They're pretty stout little bees, and they're long-tongued, and they've got really quite strong mandibles, and that's so that they can cut the leaf discs out of and use those to build their nests. They're great fun to watch, because if you get to spot a female who is building a nest, she'll fly back with this huge disc of leaf in her mouth, and you watch her deftly roll it and pull it into the nest. It's fantastic. This one here, this is the gold-tipped leafcutter bee. Again, a very common one that you might see. Also, you'll notice on the right-hand side there, that's a male. And you can see his forelimbs have got these strange little pale sort of flags, I suppose, on his forelimbs. Many of the males in the Megachilidae family have these, not all of them, but many do. And it's thought that they're for mate recognition. So if you ever spot one with those type of adaptations to their forelimbs, you know it's a male. Resin bees. So again, resin bees are in Megachilidae, so they're very closely related to the leaf cutters, but they tend to use a mixture of plant resin and chewed up leaf to create a sort of paste, which they then use to separate their cells and seal the nests with. And again, they're very, very common. You can see on the left-hand side, that's Megacardia eurifrons, the gold-browed resin bee. She's quite easy one to spot because she's got red eyes. She's not the only bee with red eyes, but she's quite a common one, and it's something you might see in your hotel. The one on the right there is Megacardia punctata, and that's the big black resin bee. She gets to about 13 millimeters long, and again, I see them all over the place, especially when I'm working with some of our old stingless beehives and there's resin around. You might find these girls will come over and try and poach some of it. Now, again, very similar to the leaf cutters, some of the males can have these modified forelimbs, so keep your eyes peeled for those. So reed bees. So I mentioned earlier on that I've used the solitary term as sort of a catch-all. So these reed bees actually can be really quite varied in their ecology and their behaviour. So many of them show social behaviours. So most solitary bees do what we call mass provisioning, which is the idea of they produce a pile of food upon which they lay the egg, they seal it, and they move on. And that amount of food is all the larva will get for its development. But many reed bees actually progressively feed their offspring. So they bring them little parcels of pollen and directly feed them and keep feeding them until they develop. So that's a sort of an advanced form of parental care that they use. Some of these can nest on their own, but some females will nest together and have a communal nest. Some will have where the first generation of her daughters will stay in the nest and help raise their siblings before they then leave and start their own. So these are some of my favourites because they really are very varied, and they don't fit inside the box of sort of solitary or completely social. So they're a really interesting group to see. And actually, because they have this idea of some social interaction, you can, under certain circumstances, have perennial nests. So the idea that that nest stays in place for a number of years and gets taken over and continues on. Interestingly as well, it's within these groups, these reed bees, what we call small carpenter bees, that the only other Australian species of eusocial bee exists. So we know we have the stingless bees, the fully social ones, and many of you will have Carbonaria on your properties, and also, of course, the western honeybee. But there is a species of, which is, I think, Echinarella tridentata, which does have distinct castes between a queen and a worker, which is really, really interesting because it's nowhere near the same size as a stingless bee colony or a western honeybee colony. Unfortunately, you won't see those in Sydney. They tend to be in arid areas. But you will see. I'd be very surprised if you don't see reed bees if you keep your eyes peeled, and they can be quite common. I've put the picture there of the sort of lantana canes where the bees have excavated. These bees are only about 5 to 8 millimeters long, so they're not very big. But what you can sometimes see is they push their abdomen up against the entrance, stop anybody coming in. So you'll see a little, often, they're not all this colour, but often a little red dot where she's put her abdomen up to stop anybody coming in. So you'll be able to provide habitat with these, with the canes, the lantana, the raspberry, and the reed. And if you're lucky enough to get them, they're great fun to watch. So this is the last group I'm going to look at in terms of the bees today. So these are what we call mast bees. So they're Hylaeinae, and they are called mast bees because they often have cream or yellow or white markings on their face. Now, they're not the only bees that have white or cream or yellow marks on their face, but that's how they got their name. Now these ones are quite inconspicuous because they're actually very wasp-like. So many people will have mistaken these for wasps. They are not very hairy at all, very hard to spot. A lot of the time they look completely hairless, corbicular, which they use to carry pollen, the females, of course. Whereas many of these mast bees, they don't have this. So they actually swallow the pollen and they store it in their crop with a mixture of honey, and then regurgitate that when they get to the nest. So in many respects, they don't look like a bee at all, but they are bees, and you will see them around. They are a little bit smaller. They tend to prefer the sort of smaller cavities, sort of 4 to 5 millimeters. Now these girls, they belong to the family Caletidae, which actually is the most speciose group in Australia. I think it makes well over 50% of the bee species in Australia from Caletidae. I think it's close to 70 actually. And that's actually it's particularly rich here in Australia. So we're very lucky to have a very, 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 very rich Caletidae family. A lot of them nest in the ground, but you will find some Hylaeus species in particular, and a couple of others that will nest in bee hotels. They have a particularly interesting trait, the family Caletidae, and that's we call them cellophane bees. And the reason for that is that they produce a salivary secretion that they use to build and line their nests. So you can see on the right-hand side there, there's these sort of strange, almost plastic-looking partitions between them. And they produce this material, and it's waterproof, and they line their cells with them. And they also, in many Hylaeus species, they also use it to cap the front of the hive as well. So it's a fantastic material, and just another ingenious adaptation that bees have. So I did say that was the last group of bees, and it is the last group of bees that we will consider proper residents of a hotel. But I do want to touch on cuckoo bees. So cuckoo bees, as the name suggests, they don't raise their own offspring. They actually parasitize the provisions of other bees. So they are the ultimate lazy parent. host species. So on the left here, you can see a sharp-tailed bee. This is from the genus Coleoxys. They tend to focus on megacylids, so we've got a little leaf-cutter bee on the right-hand side there, so she would be the host. Now, cuckoo bee offspring actually have a lot of interesting anatomical differences. So they often, a normal bee larva is essentially a maggot. It doesn't look very different to that. It's got a little head capsule with some small mandibles that it uses to consume the pollen. A lot of cuckoo bee offspring have really strongly developed head and very large mandibles, and they have that so that they can kill and eat or destroy the host larva or egg before they then take over the vision. And that sounds gruesome, and I suppose it is, but these are a natural part of the ecosystem, and many of them are incredibly beautiful. If any of you have got blue-banded bees or teddy bear bees near you, you may have blue or white markings, and they really are spectacular. So keep your eyes out for them. It's all adding to the diversity of bees that you might get if you have a bee hotel. So this is the last thing we'll touch on, and it's just the other occupants that you might see. So we talked about calling it a bee hotel, and I've very much tailored the advice today to be for bees, but that doesn't mean that they're the only group that will take residence. And in fact, you could argue that the term insect hotel and bee hotel you could sort of interchange quite easily. Wasps are probably one of the other major common additional groups that you'll find in your bee hotel. Now, wasps get a really bad rap, and it's more or less unjustified. It's often we're often thinking about yellow jackets here, or German wasps that live in hives and can be quite nasty. The wasps that nest in your bee hotel, they'll be solitary, just like the bees. They're incredibly docile, and they're not going to sting unless they are strongly threatened, and I mean sort of like squeezing them between your fingers. And the great thing about having the wasps there, especially if there's any of you watching today who are really keen gardeners or veggies and you don't want to be using pesticides, these girls, they're the ones that are going to control a lot of pests. They prey on various different insects, and they provision their nests with those because they're predatory. So having some around, that's great. They add to the natural pest control system. So be happy if you see some wasps, and they're just as interesting to watch as well. You might also see sort of flies and beetles taking shelter. There's not many that will really take up full residence, but you might see them sheltering in poor weather. There are some not so friendlies as well. So ants are one of the big ones. So ants can invade a bee hotel and sort of predate on the occupants. A really good way to avoid that is if you've got your bee hotel on a pole or something like that, then you can put some Vaseline around the pole to prevent the ants reaching it. Similarly, if it's on a tree, if you've wired it or roped it, if you can have it slightly away from the tree if it's stiffened wire, then you can do the same there. If it does get occupied by the ants, really all you can do is remove the material, shake them all out, clean it, put it back together again. Parasitoids. So these are also often wasps, although there's a few flies as well. So these are, in the similar sense to the cuckoo bees, they lay their eggs inside the nests of other bees. So the picture on the left there is a gasterupted wasp, and you can see her remarkably long ovipositor that comes off the end of her abdomen. And she uses that to pierce through the seal and then lay her eggs inside. This will ultimately cause the death of the bee that's in that cell. Now, as tragic as that is, parasitoids, again, are a natural part of the ecosystem. So we shouldn't be looking to eliminate them completely, but what we want to do is make sure that we don't artificially encourage too many of them. And that harkens back to the not having them too big, making sure you keep things clean every year, that type of thing. And then you'll have a manageable parasitization. And actually, again, from an ecological perspective, it's really interesting to watch these wasps do what they do. So enjoy all aspects of it. It isn't just about the bees. You get to make those links between lots of other groups as well. You might also find that the odd spider takes up residence. This can often put the bees off for understandable reasons. If you're using paper tube inserts, it's really easy to get rid of the spider because you can just essentially pull that tube out, put it somewhere else, replace it. That way, you've not and but you're still clearing out your hotel ready for the bees. If you haven't got that, then it's probably worth clearing her out, just because it won't be very attractive to the other bees. So that covers everything I wanted to talk about today. We could talk for so much longer about it, because there's on this last page here, I've just put a few general resources for those of you who might want to pursue it a bit further and learn a bit more. So I've got some general resources there that cover a bit of planting as well, and then a link to making mud bricks for those who want to look at the blue banded and the teddy bears. Bit about bee hotel maintenance, so a bit more detail about that, as well as a link to the Green Carpenter bee project as well. As a last thing, if there's any of you that are interested in sort of some texts or anything like that you can that you want to follow up, a really good book that I have here, it'll be reversed for you, but I'll read it out for you anyway, is A Guide to Native Bees of Australia, and that's by Terry Houston. Terry Houston's incredibly experienced, has been studying bees all his life. It's an excellent book. It covers the life history, and it also goes down more or less to genus level of a lot of your Australian bees. So you'll be able to spot a few that perhaps you weren't aware of before. And there's a few other ones as well. If anyone's interested in some of those references, then I'll make sure that I post them. So that's it from me in terms of the presentation. So I'll hand back to Lindy, and I'll hopefully answer any of your questions.
Thanks very much, Alex. We're just about out of time, actually. So I know that there is a lot to talk about. I think it's 11:30 now. So I don't know.
Oh, I do apologise. I got a bit carried away.
You did get a bit carried away, but that's fine. It's a very interesting topic. So I hope everybody enjoyed that. We've just got a few questions. They're coming in and more. I might just start with the first one was from Douglas, and was regarding mud wasps potentially using the nesting. So I think maybe that's already been answered for you, Douglas, because you were talking, Alex has covered what different insects use. And I think if you were sticking to just the bee hotel that as described, you probably wouldn't get mud wasps. Is that correct, Alex?
You might still get some mud wasps. So some of them, it depends on how they create their nests. So some of the mud wasps sort of create these sort of almost domed sort of pots. You're not like to see those, but there are some that would create sort of mud partitions in pre-existing holes, and you may get the odd mud wasp in there. It'll be very evident because they normally build an extended mud tube out of the front of the bee hotel. But again, that's part and parcel of it. You will always get some other organisms that take residence. Most of those are going to be nothing to worry about, really.
Okay. Can I just say that there was some concern about using the wood and the risk of attracting termites. Is that a possibility, or can we avoid attracting termites?
Yes, it would be, but it was going to be more. It's going to be more of a risk if that wood is dead and perhaps not raised. So in the same way that you can keep ants away, you can also keep termites away by stopping them from crawling up the stand. If it were to happen, I've not had many cases of it happening actually, because although of course when you've cut the wood it's dead. If it's strong, if it's a hardwood, and you can use, depending on what wood you use, pardon me, certain ones can be more resistant. There's a risk there, I would think, definitely, but I think you can mitigate those risks quite well by placing the hotel correctly, having it on a sort of stand or a plinth, which you can use something to stop the termites sort of crawling up. It's not something that I would be overly concerned about, and if it did happen, then it would be a simple case of, if you've used wooden blocks, let's say, which is probably the primary one that might be of an issue, you may just have to replace it. But it's not something I've encountered in any
Yes.
large volume anyway.
No, I think they prefer damp areas anyway, don't
Yes.
they, normally? Okay, so just quickly before we're running out of time, people that have taken prunings from their hydrangeas or other vines, do they have to wait for them to dry out completely before they put them into the bee hotel? And should they scoop out any of the pith, or should they just leave it?
So don't scoop out any of the pith, because the bees will do that, and that's part of their nesting behaviour. Let them dry first, just because that way you know there's no moisture left inside the cane. So what I always sort of do with this type of thing is I'll always be thinking ahead. So if I'm trimming something at some time of the year, I think, right, that'll be useful for later. You can hang it, dry it, and use it sometime in the future. Once you've started doing the bee hotel, it becomes easier because you can work on a cycle, and then you can keep a backlog of materials that you can use.
Okay, all right. Douglas asks us if it's appropriate to put a bee hotel on top of a water tank. It depends how secure it is, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of any particular reason why that wouldn't work. As long as it's secure, it should be fine, and as long as it's still sheltered and it's not exposed, I think it should be okay. The advantage of the bee hotel is that if you find that it doesn't work one year, once winter comes around and there's nobody in it, you can try it somewhere else.
Okay, and Emma asks about painting the hotel. Are there any colours that should be avoided, or some that might they might find more attractive? I mean, particular colours?
It's a good question, actually. I don't know whether there's any colours that should particularly be avoided. Bees don't tend to see very well in the red wavelength of light, so very few bees can see red. So if you painted it red, it probably wouldn't do anything. But other than that, I can't think of a particular reason why it would be bad to paint it any particular colour. They would soon work out that it wasn't a flower quite rapidly.
Yeah.
Okay. And no, I can't think of any major reason why colour would be a particular issue.
Okay.
Maybe sort of blues and yellows would be more attractive in terms of bringing them in, because that tends to be the colour of their flowers. But you've got to remember that they're not looking for a flower; they're looking for a nest. So the reasoning for the search is different. So I wouldn't worry too much about colour.
Okay, thanks very much, Alex. Well, that's the end of the written questions. But as we said before, if anybody has more questions for Alex, they can contact him at council on the Wild Things email, wildthings.kmc.nsw.gov.au. But otherwise, I think our time is up. Actually, I don't know. No, somebody wrote a question and then dismissed it, so that's okay. So I hope you've all enjoyed that. And as I said, the presentation is recorded and it will be on the website for you shortly. But if you've got any other questions, just direct them to Alex. And thank you very much for joining us today. Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Right. Thanks very much, Alex.
No problem. I'll leave the screen a bit longer in case any stragglers want to take down some details.
Yeah, I think we'll just stay here till everybody leaves. But probably people are writing down some information.
Yeah.
Still have a few people. I don't know. I'm not sure if they're still taking information down or.
I suppose you can end it though, can't you?
Yeah, I don't like to cut them off though if they're trying to.
In case they're writing something down, yeah.
Yeah. I think I can probably. Not sure. I mean, I can. We have a Craig, a Jack, and a Jackie still participating. Do you still want more time? Could you just answer on the Q&A if you still need more time? Craig, Jack, or Jackie? Okay, so I don't think they're responding. So I think that it's okay for us to leave.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's good. I was thought that the actual it might just cut off.
Well, no, because we've got the license is unlimited now, isn't it?
Oh, that's true. That's true.
I don't think it will cut off unless you actually leave, just because it's unlimited minutes now.
Oh, that's
so.
all right. All right.
Yeah.
So, Karen, thanks very much for being the co-host there. I see that so it looks as if there's still.
Yes, there are 3 more. We can remove them ourselves if you like.
Yeah.
Let's do that just in case.
Okay, I'll just do that now then.
Yeah. Only
Okay.
because.
All right.
I didn't want to abruptly end it if they were trying to write down information.
Yeah, of course.
But I think that I did. I mean, you know,
You did put
I can send this slide out if people request it.
Yeah.
All right. So I've just removed all the attendees now, so it's just the 3 of us.